The room was dark, and the strong antiseptic smell blended with the subtle aroma of lies that lay on the bedside. Thomas Weir, a man who used to be lively and full of fun, lay still in his. After 73 years of hard effort, he was in a hospital bed, breathing shallowly and laboring. His silent efforts and familial devotion had finally caught up with him, and he was now at the end phase of his existence. However, in the gloomy setting, one person remained on. The faithful golden retriever of Baxter Thomas was cuddled up at the base of the. At the age of 12, his amber eyes were sparkling with an expression that could only be characterized as heartbreakingly human. Thomas had always had Baxter by his side, sharing the peaceful porch mornings and the chaotic evenings of isolation that occasionally beset the elderly man nowadays, but the nurses noticed an odd uneasiness in place of Baxter's typical warmth and vigor. Spoke about the dog's exceptional loyalty, saying that he hasn't left the room in 3 days. Another muttered that he even skips meals as though he is aware that their voices are hesitant to finish the phrase. Emily, Thomas's daughter, was sitting by her father's bedside, her fingertips delicately grazing his weak hand. She said to a nurse, "Baxter has always been like this," as she looked at him with a mixture of appreciation and curiosity. "Lately, it seems as though he is attempting to communicate with us." The only sound to break the silence was the faint beeping of the heart monitor and the sporadic shuffling of footsteps outside. Emily recalled the innumerable moments she and Baxter shared. In the evening, the dog would quietly sit by Thomas's feet or nudge his hand for rewards, according to the father. Prayers, and Baxter became more resolute as Thomas approached the end, more willing than ever to be by his side, even though no one could have understood the truth Baxter held. Coherent. But as the minutes passed and the room became quieter, it strengthened his unwavering devotion. The tale of the peaceful hum of the hospital room was about to reveal the relationship and the devastating revelation it would bring. Emily couldn't get rid of the sense of urgency in Baxter's voice, which was only broken by the machine's steady beeping. Behavior bent over and caressed the dog's head, which was now strewn with. Although the silver felt warm beneath her palm, there was a noticeable restlessness in his eyes. It seemed as though Baxter was carrying a message that was very important to his devoted heart. His devotion to Thomas had always been exceptional since Thomas brought him home as a boisterous puppy, and their relationship had remained unbreakable when Baxter was the one who gave his life new meaning and happiness after Thomas retired from his position as a schoolteacher. They established routines that included calm evenings near the park, morning strolls through the park, and afternoons spent reading on the porch. Thomas used to joke around the fireplace that Baxter knew me better than anyone, including you, Emily, but the previous year had been. Thomas's health had begun to deteriorate more quickly than anyone had anticipated, beginning with weariness. Baxter appeared to notice it before anybody else did, since it quickly progressed into inexplicable weight loss and chronic coughing. Emily initially believed that Thomas's refusal to leave his side was just the dog's innate devotion, but when she saw him cuddle up to her on the hospital bed, she sensed something deeper at play. Emily replied to her father, while gently removing a lock of hair from her face. Thomas's eyelids flitted open. "And you noticed that Baxter hasn't abandoned you? He's always been like this. Weak but warm," he muttered in a scarcely audible voice as he gazed at his daughter. "Ichike, a nice boy. Always has been, but I believe he is aware of something about today." Knowing what her father had said, Emily's chest constricted as she leaned on him. Closer, but Thomas didn't respond. His vitality was too low, and his eyelids closed once again. Emily continued by looking down at Baxter, who was still staring at Thomas. She couldn't get rid of the sensation that the dog was attempting to communicate with her, his body tight, as if he were on watch duty. Later that afternoon, the physician arrived with a professional, yet compassionate demeanor. "Can I talk to you, Emily?" he requested, gesturing for her to go outside, which she did grudgingly, casting a concernedly. She turned to face her father and Baxter in the hallway as the doctor described Thomas's condition. "Deteriorating. He might only have a few days left," he remarked softly. "We know we should do everything we can to keep him at ease, but it's crucial that you be ready," Emily said, knotting her throat tightly. "Thank you, doctor." She spoke in a strained tone, but as she went to return inside, she stopped and was struck with the question, "Can you?" She asked in a voice that was almost begging, "Tell me, or do you think Baxter being here is helping him?" The doctor grinned. Animals can provide comfort in subtle ways that doctors cannot explain. I would suggest that Baxter's presence is more beneficial than just enabling Emily return to the room if it brings your father serenity. Discovered Baxter still at his position, kneeling next to him and rubbing her fingers over his fur. "You're incredible, you know that she." Baxter peered up at her in a whisper, his amber eyes brimming with an emotion she couldn't quite put her finger on. As night fell and the hospital room became quiet, Emily had a profound thought. Refused to go for the night, dragging a chair near Thomas's bed, and Baxter stayed alert, seldom moving from. At one moment, Emily fell asleep, his ears twitching at every sound. She was ultimately overcome by tiredness, and Baxter's gentle wake-up call caused the dog to get up. He put his head gently on Thomas's arm while his body shook a little, making another deep, melancholy moan that made Emily's heart ache. Shocked at the sight, she reached out to caress his back while whispering, "I'm here too, boy. It's okay." But as she did so, a strange incident occurred when Baxter pushed a tiny leather pouch that was resting on the bedside table. He made a purposeful move as if he wanted her to see it. Emily scowled and picked up the sack. "What is this, Dad?" Even though she knew her father was too feeble to respond, she whispered. When she opened the pouch, she discovered an assortment of ancient photos, the most of which showed Thomas and Baxter on their escapades together. But one in particular struck her eye. It showed Thomas cradling Baxter as a puppy, and there was a look on his face that went beyond simple love. The lines, "Forte are my guardian, my gift Hill's hands," were written in Thomas's immaculate handwriting on the reverse of the picture. Shuddering, she read the words "guardian" out loud and glanced at Baxter, who was observing her closely, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed to be waiting for her to comprehend what her father's call to Baxter would entail. A guardian, and as Emily's hours passed, why did the dog appear so anxious to remain with him? At this precise moment, discovered that she was reluctant to let go of the odd sense of urgency because there was an unspoken truth lingering in. Baxter's constant presence felt like a key in the air that was waiting to be unlocked, but Emily was unaware that the soft glow of the hospital lights created long shadows throughout the room where she was sitting. With the tiny leather pouch still in her hands, she carefully examined the pictures in the chair by Thomas's bed. Each picture conveyed a tale, as I flipped through them one by one after lunch at the lake while trekking in the beautiful autumn. Lazy afternoons by the fireplace in Woodlands, but the final image was different. Image of a young Thomas standing next to a golden retriever rather than Thomas and Baxter. Its pelt was strikingly similar to Baxter's, and the dog's keen gaze was the same. Rusty's name, Rusty Emily, was written in faded ink on the back in an alert position. Confused, she murmured as she glanced down at Baxter, who was once more sleeping next to Thomas, his nose resting on. Baxter and the dog in the picture looked so similar, almost eerie, on the man's weak arm. Was that possible? Thomas's childhood dog must have been Rusty, but why had her father kept him? This photograph was concealed, but as she was thinking, Thomas suddenly moved, opening his eyes and he tilted his head feebly in Emily's direction and spoke in a hardly discernible voice. She leaned closer and murmured, "Dad, I'm here." Thomas's eyes changed. With a slight smile on his lips, he returned to Baxter and muttered his. Emily scowled in confusion. "What do you mean, Dad, who came?" Emily spoke with hardly a breath. As he reached for the picture in her hands, Thomas's hand shook back. "Rusty," he whispered, his voice cracking with feeling I never imagined. Yet he returned as my supporter and has always been my protector. When her father said, "Dad, you're not making sense. Baxter is just a dog," Emily's pulse raced. Thomas weakly shook his head, claiming that he had previously been with me and that he wasn't just a dog. "There's a reason he's here," Emily thought, and she felt a chill. The theory appeared unbelievable, even fantastical, but the father genuinely believed that Baxter was the reincarnation of his childhood dog. Nevertheless, she was unable to ignore Baxter's behavior as she gazed at him. She had never witnessed anything like his commitment and his extraordinary timing. Thomas whispered, Take care of him." As his eyelids drifted closed once again. "He'll look after you," Emily said as she leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Baxter's eyes were filled with a quiet intensity as he raised his head slightly, perhaps understanding. The next morning, Emily made the decision to delve more into all Thomas had mentioned. Left the hospital for a short while to go to her father's house in the hopes of discovering some answers among his possessions. Felt uncomfortably quiet in her father's study, which was full with memories of her early years. In a drawer, she discovered a stack of old journals, which she perused in an attempt to find any reference to Rusty. Regarding Baxter, she noticed an entry that said March 14th, almost a year before Baxter entered Thomas's life. 2009. Although it has been decades since Rusty's passing, I had another dream about him last night. The dream seemed so vivid, and when I woke up, he was standing next to me as usual. Awoke with this weird sensation that he's still alive, even though it might simply be wishful thinking, but it's reassuring to think. When Emily read the words her father had dreamed of Rusty before he died, her breath caught. "He's still watching out for me." Adopted Baxter. Could it be that he had anticipated Baxter's arrival in some way? She kept looking, discovering further notes that alluded to Thomas's strong relationship with Rusty and his conviction that the dog and humans are spiritually connected. A journal entry from the day Thomas brought Baxter home caught his attention. "When I first saw him at the shelter on November 2nd, 2010, I was at a loss for words, but I can't get rid of the sensation that I didn't choose Rusty. He selected me. It was like seeing into his eyes again. There's a reason he's here." Emily closed the journal, her hands shaking at the thought. Appeared ridiculous, but there was proof that her father had thought Baxter was more than just a dog. Thought that Baxter was a part of something bigger, a guardian assigned to safeguard and guide him as he went back to the hospital. Emily discovered Baxter still standing at his position, leaning his head against Thomas's hand. Baxter knelt next to him, her heart heavy with a mix of shock and wonder. "Are you really Rusty?" she said in a tremulous whisper as the dog raised his head. He leaned forward, leaning his head against her chest as he met her stare with an expression so profound it caused her chest to tighten. Her shoulder, and Emily briefly experienced a strong feeling of oneness. That was inexplicable. Thomas became weaker during the day, yet his last. That night, his comments to Emily were unambiguous and resolute. "He is your guardian." Now, the soft murmur of the. Emily waited at Thomas's bedside while hospital monitors filled the room as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The notion that Baxter might be more than just a faithful friend to her father left her thinking in a jumbled muddle. Words like, "he's your guardian," persisted, but Baxter held his head firmly, lightly leaning on Thomas's weak hand. He had hardly moved since they arrived, save for shifting positions when Thomas. Nevertheless, the dog's presence was unquestionably special. A soothing energy appeared to permeate the. A nurse entered the room as dusk was falling, protecting Emily from the misery that threatened to overtake her. She stopped to check Thomas's vitals and gave Baxter a kind smile, saying, "He hasn't left your father's side." It seems as though he knows. The nurse nodded because Emily never shook her head. Animals can sense things thoughtfully, and they frequently know when someone is near death. After hesitating to reassure us, Emily chose to express her father's conviction that Dad believes Baxter is related to his former dog Rusty, who returned in some way. The nurse's EXP expression softened to watch over him. "I've witnessed weird phenomena. The connection between a person and their pet is unique at times, sometimes even inexplicable. Perhaps your father is correct." Emily turned after the nurse gone. She crouched next to Baxter and ran her fingers through his fur. She said, "What are you trying to tell us, boy? Are you really here for him for?" Emily experienced a surge of emotion as Baxter's amber eyes locked with hers, cascade over her, as though the dog could see right into her heart and comprehend all of her fears and uncertainties. Despite the uncertainties, he grounded her with his warmth by nuzzling her palm. Emily was unable to go that night, so she cuddled up on the chair by Thomas's bed and fell asleep. In her fantasies, she saw Rusty as a dog instead of the one in the picture. In a sunny field, a golden shadow stood next to him, and Baxter there. A feeling of peace overcame her as she saw shapes merging into one, as though they were the same soul in separate lifetimes. Emily woke up startled by a whisper that seemed to echo in her mind. Believe him. Her heart was racing, and the only sounds in the room were Baxter's steady presence and Thomas's gentle breathing. Rusty, she said, testing as she gazed at the dog in her dream, which was still vivid in her head. As if accepting her remarks, Thomas's ears twitched when he heard the name Baxter. The next day, the doctor gently explained that it was time to make him as comfortable as possible as his health worsened, and Emily concurred. She sat next to her father and held his hand as her chest constricted, and Baxter stayed by his side, a silent sentinel, while family and friends spent the hours. Some were shocked to observe the dog's continuous watch when they arrived to say their goodbyes, but no one questioned it. Later that night, as the room grew empty, Emily gave multiple explanations of the family, and Thomas stirred feebly, his eyes fluttered open, briefly becoming clear and brimming with an extraordinary brilliance. He glanced at Emily, then at Emily. Baxter said in a scarcely audible voice, a small smile appearing on his lips. Audible, keep in mind that he is yours. Look after him, and he will look after you. As she nodded, tears fell down her cheeks. I swear, Dad. Thomas's eyes turned to Baxter, and his palm shook as Baxter leaned down to touch the dog's tail as he stretched to pat his head and muttered, "Thank you for everything," softly wagging. It was an expression of appreciation, as though he too recognized the gravity of the situation. As Thomas inhaled deeply and breathed his last breath, the room became quiet, and the air was heavy with loss. Emily sobbed silently while burying her face in her hands, while Baxter remained by her side. The following days were spent with his head on her lap, providing the quiet comfort that only he could. Were blur, and Emily discovered that she was depending on Baxter more than she had ever imagined, because the dog was a constant source of strength, his presence serving as a reminder of the last words her father spoke one afternoon. Emily discovered a box marked "Rusty Memories" while going through her father's possessions. Collars, a notebook with pictures and comments about her father's life, and toys. Every page of his first dog's narrative detailed their adventures, their bond, and the unwavering affection they had for one another. Emily discovered a handwritten message from her father at the far back of the scrapbook. "I'll know I've done something right in life if Rusty ever comes back to me, and if he stays to keep watch over." Emily held the message to her chest and let her tears stream freely. "When I'm gone, I'll know she's in excellent hands." Regarded Baxter, who was resting at her feet, his eyes observing her with a silent comprehension. "You've been with all of us." Baxter wagged his tail as she said, "Along, haven't you?" Emily had a glimmer of optimism that her father might have passed away, but his legacy and guardian endured in the days that followed. Though life gradually started to move on after Thomas's death, Emily found solace in her backers. The dog's constant presence had become her fulcrum, and his calm company a recurring reminder of her father's affection and the peculiar, almost supernatural bond that appeared to unite them all. But even though Emily had unanswered questions, the message she discovered in her father's scrapbook was consoling and disturbing. How could Thomas have known that Baxter would be experiencing anything exceptional one afternoon? Emily discovered an antique trunk that had belonged to her grandmother while she was organizing the attic. Coated with cobwebs and dust, evidently unaltered for years, she looked through a collection of notebooks she had found, their leather covers broken and worn with age. And discovered records pertaining to Rusty. Her grandmother's handwriting indicated that Rusty was more than simply a household pet. Been her father's steadfast friend at some of the most trying periods of his life, including the death of his own father. Establishing his foothold as a young adult and battling through college. But one entry particularly struck Emily's attention. Rusty had a keen sense of humans and could see danger before it materialized. He provided comfort without. Some may refer to this as instinct, but I've always felt that there was a need to defend without hesitation. Emily shuddered when she heard the word guardian, suggesting that he was more than simply a dog. Spine, it repeated the nurse's remark that animals possess an innate capacity to. She gazed down at Baxter, who had followed her into the attic and was now sleeping at her feet, and sensed things that humans couldn't. She said softly, "What are you, boy?" Baxter's tail waggled, but his amber eyes appeared to possess a knowing gleam as though she recognized the significance of her inquiry. During that week, Emily made the decision to come. Even though she wasn't totally sure, she wanted answers from the veterinary clinic where her father had initially adopted Baxter. What to ask the clinic was tiny and comfortable, and the receptionist was polite and remembered Baxter. Immediately sure, Baxter Thomas visited to see how he was doing nearly every month. The receptionist smiled warmly and continued, "Love this puppy like family." Emily paused before answering. Do you recall anything out of the ordinary concerning my dad's adoption?" The receptionist frowned, believing I wasn't working here at the time, but Dr. Harper was there. Perhaps she remembers. Let me get her a short while later, an elderly woman wearing a white coat and having gentle eyes entered the foyer. "Emily, it's great to see you. I'm sorry about your father. He was a great man." "Thank you," Dr. Harper remarked. Emily answered, "I would like to know if there is anything you can tell me about Back." I do recall that Dr. Harper's face softened when my dad adopted him. When Baxter was brought in, he was adrift, terrified, yet remarkably gentle. He clicked with your dad very immediately, as though he had been waiting for him. Emily agreed. Yes, Dr. Harper nodded and recalled making a joke about it with your father, stating that Baxter must have known he would come get him. It was amazing since usually strays are afraid of strangers, but Baxter approached your dad directly. Emily felt a knot form in her throat as she leaned into him as though they were already old friends. "Do you think it's likely that he knew my dad in some way? Perhaps they had met previously, Doctor. I've seen a lot in my years as a veterinarian," Harper stated after he paused. "Animals have ways of interacting with people that I can't quite explain it, but that night, Emily, there was an unmistakable kinship between Baxter and your father." Dr. Harper's words and the writings from her father's scrapbook were sitting on the couch. In her mind, Baxter was lying next to her, possibly with his head resting on her lap. She remarked out loud, "You're more than just a dog, but why are you here and why is your phone buzzing now?" dragging her away from. She believed it was a text from Mrs. Hargrove, an old family friend who had known her father since she was a young girl. Emily swiftly responded, "I've been thinking about Thomas and Rusty. If you're free, I'd love to share some stories with you." Scheduling a visit because she thought Mrs. Hargrove would know the answers to the questions that were starting to devour her. The following day, Emily arrived at Mrs. Hargrove's house, where the elderly woman welcomed her with open arms. "Since the burial, sweetheart, I've been meaning to speak with you." Emily took a seat, and Mrs. Hargrove immediately jumped in. According to her recollections, Thomas and Rusty shared a kinship unlike any other. The dog was more than just a pet. He served as his guardian. Did Rusty ever save Thomas from a horrible catastrophe when he was roughly your age? It seemed almost as though he knew what would happen before it happened. So when Emily inquired about the nature of the accident, Mrs. Harrow's interest was piqued. "I was working late one night, and Rusty wouldn't stop," she said, lowering her voice. Barking, he pulled him from the home, and a few seconds after that, the roof fell in. Thomas wouldn't have lived if Rusty hadn't intervened. Emily sat back, her thoughts whirling. Although the puzzle's parts were coming together, the image they created was unlike anything she had ever seen. Wondered if Baxter was there for her as well as for her father, and if so, what was he protecting her from? The more Emily learned about her father Rusty, and, more recently, Baxter, the more her mental struggle led her to wonder if this was all a coincidence, or if anything really remarkable was happening at play. She was unable to get rid of the impression that Baxter's entrance into their lives and her father's parting remarks was no coincidence. One evening when the sun was setting and a golden light filled the house, with Baxter by her side and the weight of her discoveries pressing down on her chest, Emily sat on the porch. She was deep in concentration as she gazed at the horizon when her phone rang with a message asking how she was doing from her fiancé, Michael. Emily was hesitant to answer since she loved Michael. "But you're holding her up." Even she found everything she had discovered to be ridiculous. So how could she explain it? Instead, she said, "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." A few moments later, Michael's gentle and sympathetic voice said, "I know you're not." She finally broke down to Michael, saying, "Okay, please talk to me." She was crying because it was Baxter, and he wasn't just I don't know how to describe it, but I feel like my dog is shielding me from something I don't understand. After a brief period of silence, Michael softly inquired, "What makes you think that?" Emily described all that was written in Dr. Harper's writings and her father's scrapbook, and Miss Harrow-Story's voice was shaking toward the conclusion. "I sound crazy, don't you?" She was shocked by Michael's response. "No, you don't, Emily. Animals have a way of... I've read about dogs spotting diseases and alerting people to impending tragedies. So perhaps Baxter is." Emily looked down at Baxter, who was observing, "But the question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I need answers," she muttered, listening carefully as if she understood every word. The next morning, Emily chose to pretend to be Baxter in order to find out why he was here. Had a genuine relationship with her father. Maybe going back to the locations they frequented together would provide further hints, so she packed a bag, took Baxter's leash, and headed to the hiking path that her father loved. Thomas frequently went to this remote trail that wound through the woods for solitude and introspection as they walked the memories. Returned in full force, and she could just see her father in front of her, his bright grin and steady gait lighting up the path. Baxter followed along her, occasionally being unusually attentive. He would pause, take a whiff of the air, then glance back at Emily, as though to be sure. Halfway through the trail, Baxter's ears perked up, and he abruptly froze. She was fine. Emily's heart skipped a beat as a deep growl rumbled in his throat. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, and Baxter turned abruptly. Emily's heart accelerated as branches snapped as she was pulled on the leash and led off the path and into the dark woods. Baxter slowed down beneath her, and she cried out, "I'm having trouble keeping up," and eventually they arrived in a tiny clearing where an ancient oak tree with a huge trunk stood. Age-worn and twisted, Emily recognized it right away as the Baxter sat at the base of the site her father named his sanctuary, where he frequently took her when she was a youngster. He poured at the ground, his tail waving gently, and whined softly, as though Emily knelt and started to remove the leaves and dirt, telling her to take a closer look. To her surprise, she saw her hands shook as she opened the small, old, but undamaged wooden box, displaying a number of objects, including a picture of her father with Rusty. She unwrapped a handwritten note and a tarnished necklace, gasping as she realized it was her. "If you're reading this, my love, Emily, it indicates that Baxter has brought you here. I'm not sure how to explain it, but these amazing dogs have always been a part of our family. Rusty has saved my life numerous times, and you can now rely on Baxter to help you when you need it most." Emily held the letter close to her bosom, exactly as Rusty had taught me to love always, Dad. She looked at her, who was now sitting calmly, and tears were running down her face. She muttered, her amber eyes full of what could only be characterized as understanding that you are more than simply a dog. Emily's thoughts raced on the walk home after reading the letter, which both confirmed her suspicions and brought up new inquiries as to why her father helped her when she most needed it. May returned to perhaps understand her destiny that she didn't. And when they got home, Emily experienced a renewed feeling of, with a purpose, she would not simply let this enigma unsolved. Discover all of the secrets her father had concealed, and at last comprehend the reality of Baxter's influence on her life. But even as a glimmer of terror appeared in her heart, as she decided to move forward if Baxter was present to keep her safe. But what precisely was he shielding her from in the days following her discovery of her father's letter at the... There was a mixture of anxiety and hope anticipating Emily Baxter's arrival at Oak Tree. Once a mere comfort, his ears now held an indisputable weight. She wondered what he was doing as he twitched or as he gazed intensely at a seemingly empty part of the room. Sensing that her father's possessions would provide more insight into their relationship, Emily chose to concentrate on them once more. She spent hours looking through photo albums, journals, and other material kept in them. She discovered another odd item among the things, a corroded compass concealed in a velvet purse bearing the initials. At first glance, the compass with TM inscribed on the reverse didn't seem noteworthy, but after closely examining it, Emily squinted to discern the faded inscriptions and saw a faint inscription down its edge. Emily put the compass on her nightstand and lay in bed restlessly that night after learning that you should always find your way home. As usual, Backmer curled up on the floor next to her, but his eyes were still focused on the window, and his ears were pricked up. Emily said in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper, "What is it, boy?" Baxter didn't react with his typical tail wagging or comforting look. Instead, he got up, padded up to the window, and growled softly. Emily sat up, with her heart racing. She reached for her phone and switched on the flashlight, illuminating the blackness outside. "You're just frightened, Baxter, Emily, by the swaying trees and the dim streetlight." She closed the blinds and continued, "I'm not sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself." Went back to bed, but Emily found it difficult to fall asleep. So the following morning, she made the decision to. She invited Michael and Mrs. Hargrove over to discuss what she had discovered in the hopes that their viewpoints would may help to clarify the increasing enigma surrounding this compass I discovered among my dad's belongings. As they sat around the kitchen table, Emily explained. She gave it to Michael, who flipped it over in his hands. His furrowed brow and the inscription seemed to be a message, but I'm not sure what it's referring to, or even whether it's pointing at anything. Mrs. Hargrove looked at the compass and gasped in response to everything. "I recall that. After Rusty's death, your father always carried a compass, saying it served as a reminder to him that no matter how." Emily's heart ached at the memory of what she had asked, but he believed he could always find his way back. Michael's expression changed to one of thoughtfulness, more to herself than to anybody else. "Do you think this could be a literal message?" Emily mentioned that there might be another location you need to look for, which is just what I've been wondering, but where do I? Even before then, Mrs. Hargrove put a consoling hand on Emily's. "Just as Baxter led you to that letter, sometimes the ANS finds you precious." Later that day, Emily made the decision to trust him, chose to test the compass while walking Baxter through the woods, where she discovered the letter she was holding. Holding a compass and seeing the needle's wild swing before it eventually settled in one direction. "Let's see," she whispered to Baxter, "where it leads," and he waved his tail as though he agreed, so they followed the compass farther into. Emily couldn't get rid of the impression that they were in the forest, where the air was getting colder and the trees were getting denser with every step. After over an hour of traveling, they arrived to a place where they were being led by something more than simply the compass. In the middle of a tiny clearing she had never seen before was a rundown cabin with wooden walls that had aged over time. Baxter gave a single, sharp bark before sprinting to the ground and waiting for Emily. Called, her voice resonating in the silence, as she gingerly made her way to the cabin, keeping her compass in place. When she pushed the creaking door open with her hand, a single dusty chamber was revealed. Baxter was sniffing close to the wooden table, an ancient rocking rocker, and a stack of yellowed papers that were sparsely furnished within. Fireplace with his tail waving wildly, Emily crouched next to him and discovered a tiny. Her hands shook as she removed the locked chest that was concealed beneath a loose floorboard. The chest was decorated with. The initials TM are inscribed on the lid, along with elaborate carvings of leaves and vines. "Back home, Emily whispered this to my dad," her voice halting in her throat. Emily opened the chest with a set of antique keys she had discovered among her father's possessions, and more pictures were within. She was stunned by the first entry in a little leather-bound journal in letters. "Trust Baxter, Emily. He's here for you just as Rusty was, no matter what happens. Some things, in my opinion, cannot be described. They can only be felt. You'll comprehend the remainder of the." Her father's life after Rusty's death was described in her notebook, including how he had battled loss and sought comfort in nature and eventually took Baxter in, but there were also notes of odd things that happened to him, nightmares that he couldn't understand, and sensations of being observed and instances in which Baxter appeared to step in just as Emily was closing the journal. There was a knock. She was startled at the door and opened it to see Michael's anxious countenance. "Emily, Mrs. Hargrove called me just now and claimed she had a significant memory regarding your dad and Rusty." Emily's heartbeat increased as she spoke, and Michael hesitated before telling me over the phone. "Something you had to hear firsthand." Emily snatched her coat at the doorway as Baxter barked gently, seemingly begging them to leave. Notebook, her heart racing as she readied herself to reveal another dimension of the enigma Emily and Michael had deduced. As the sun sank below the horizon, Miss Hargrove's house cast long shadows across the peaceful neighborhood. As usual, Baxter remained on Emily's side, moving calmly but purposefully. Mrs. Hargrove greeted them at the door with a tense smile, as though he too felt the gravity of the situation. Her friendly manner was tinged with uneasiness, and she immediately led them into her living room, which had a subtle scent of old books and lavender, a soothing combination that stood in stark contrast to the tension in the air. "I appreciate you attending." Mrs. Hargrove started by gesturing for them to sit, her hands quivering a little. "I've been putting things together ever since. I need to tell you something that I should have disclosed years ago, since you brought up the compass and the journal." "What is it, Mrs. Emily?" Emily leaned closer and held the journal in her lap. Hargrove paused, her attention darting to Baxter, who had taken up residence at Emily's feet but maintained a piercing stare on. Her voice was hardly audible above a whisper as she stated, "It's about Rusty and your father." She started telling them a story that happened, and explained why your father was so determined to keep you and back near. Like a long-forgotten memory revived, Rusty was first adopted by Emily's father years ago. Told Miss Hargrove about an odd incident he couldn't explain. Rusty had demonstrated a remarkable capacity to detect danger, frequently behaving as if he anticipated trouble before others did. "Mrs. Hargrove, Rusty stopped your father from crossing a river while he was traveling alone in the woods," she continued in a shaky voice. "He claimed that Rusty saved his life, and the next day, that very area was washed away in a flood." Emily nodded, her heart heavy with the. She whispered, "He always knows when," echoing her father's comments in the notebook that sounded like Baxter. Mrs. Hargrove kept looking off into space, as if she were reliving the. "After some time, your father grew to believe that Rusty was more than just a dog. Rather, he was a defender and guardian. When Rusty died, he thought Bond would continue with the next dog he got." Emily looked at Baxter, who was observing. "Do you think that's why my dad chose Baxter?" Mrs. Hargrove questioned, her voice so intense it sent shivers down her spine. I think Mrs. Hargrove hesitated before nodding, which is why he consistently claimed to have felt Rusty had somehow guided him to that shelter at that precise moment, and he felt a connection with Baxter the instant he spotted him. After listening silently, Michael eventually responded, "But why the secrecy?" Mrs. Hargrove said that he was concerned, but why didn't he just inform Emily about this instead of frightening her? He didn't really comprehend it, even though it would sound unbelievable. Emily was processing the revelation, her father's notebook, the compass, and the letter from the oak tree. Everything suggested a connection that was deeper than she could understand, but one question stood out more than the others. Her voice broke as she questioned, "Relax. Why is this all happening now?" Mrs. Hargrove's face darkened when my dad left, and I'm not sure why. Acknowledged. "But I am aware that Baxter, like Rusty, is attempting to keep you safe. They left Mrs. Hargrove's home with the burden of protecting your father, so you must have faith in him no matter what." While Michael remained behind with Baxter, Emily continued to walk ahead, lost in meditation as her words lingered in the air. Michael asked in a low voice, "Do you think it's true that you seem unusually restless?" About Baxter being some sort of good guardian, Emily stopped and looked back at them. I'm not sure if she acknowledged it, but he constantly seems to know what I need before I do, as if he's connected to something I can't see. I felt the same way. When they arrived at the car, Baxter paused and then leaped, his ears twitching as if he heard a disturbance. They were unable to hear Emily, who scowled and said, "What's it, boy?" "Baxter." Emily followed his stare, but she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary when his eyes darted toward the woods in the distance. Emily felt uneasy because it seemed like something invisible was watching them from the home. In an attempt to dispel the suspicion that Baxter was warning her, she went back to her father's journal in the hopes that it might. Michael stayed with her while they sorted through the letters and photos they discovered in the chest to find further hints. "Look at this," he said, displaying a picture of her father and Rusty by the oak tree. After taking a second look at the picture, Emily noticed that Rusty was clutching the same compass that Emily had found, and her father was. Baxter growled abruptly as he was sitting at his feet, looking straight into the camera with an almost knowing expression. He was standing at the door, stunning them both with his body rigid and his tail stiff. After exchanging anxious looks, Emily and Michael hurried to check what had captured his interest: the porch light. Baxter. A chilly breeze blew through the yard as they walked outside. His eyes were focused on the woods, and he growled deep in his throat. Emily's heart was pounding. She trembled as she muttered, "What's out there?" as she followed his gaze and saw nothing but shadows. Barked once more before glancing up at her with a sense of desperation that she couldn't ignore. Whatever was coming, they weren't. Meanwhile, Emily's house was enveloped in darkness, and the air was heavy with a palpable sense of foreboding. Emily was sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by her father's old journal, when the ticking of the clock broke the stillness. Baxter was lying next to her with his head resting on her, photos and letters scattered all over the place. But his ears perked up at every noise, his body stiff with stress, and his actions had become more defensive, and Emily couldn't deny the feeling that something important was going to. "This place," Michael replied, sitting across from her and looking at the map they had discovered in one of the packages, indicating a designated spot far into the forest where your father wrote in his journal, "Rusty." Emily saved him by using her finger to follow the map's lines while he wrote about feeling something there. Couldn't describe it, but Baxter growled softly as if Rusty were directing him toward or away from something. Attracting their attention, he suddenly stood with his eyes focused on the front entrance, and Emily followed him. The room appeared to seize its breath as Baxter approached the door, his steps sluggish, her heart fast. "What is it, boy?" And methodical, he gave a harsh, demanding growl before turning back to face Emily as. Emily and Michael looked at each other, and Michael nodded. "So let's." They grabbed a flashlight to check what was happening and went outside into the porch, where the temperature was lower than it should have been for the season, and Baxter stood at the edge of the porch while the trees swayed uncannily in the windless night. Every muscle in his body tensed as if it were about to flex. "What?" Emily murmured. "Is that Baxter?" The dog barked, his gaze locked on the woods. Emily's eyes followed his, but the shadows obscured whatever had caught his interest, so she looked at Michael. Michael hesitated before nodding. "But if Baxter believes there's something out there, we should check it out. Must have faith in him." They snatched up their jackets and trailed Baxter as he guided them into the woods. His footsteps were, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He was confident and methodical. Emily's hold on the flashlight tightened as they went farther into the trees, the light piercing the shadows but showing little. The quiet was. Baxter abruptly halted, his ears perked up, and the crush of their footfall on the forest floor was the only sound to break the stifling silence. He growled low, causing Emily to freeze and her heart to race. "What was it, boy?" Before Michael could react, Baxter sprang forward, barking wildly as a rustling sound came from the bushes, covering Emily as though to protect her from harm. Emily shone the spotlight toward the direction of the north, and for a brief moment she gasped and gripped Michael's arm, thinking she saw a pair of blazing eyes reflecting back at her. "We must continue moving," even though Michael's voice sounded tense. Baxter didn't wait. He started to walk again after their decision, his growls low but relentless. The rustle trailed them deeper into the forest, always staying out of sight, which increased their uneasiness after. After what seemed like an age, they arrived at a tiny clearing where an ancient oak tree with twisted limbs stood, reaching skyward like twisted fingers. Emily recognized it instantly from her father's journal and the photos. "This is it," she replied in a tremulous whisper, "where my dad claimed that Baxter circled the base and Rusty saved him." Emily knelt next to him as he sniffed frantically from the tree. She gasped as she put down the flashlight after her palm brushed against something in the dirt. It was the identical compass her father had spoken of, partially buried in the ground and with an aged, tarnished surface. Michael squatted next to her, looking at the ground, and she took it up, turning it over in her hands. "He must have left it here. Do you believe he was attempting to leave us a message?" Baxter interrupted their thoughts with a piercing bark and stood. He was stiff, staring toward the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Emily followed him, her stomach churning with dread. As the rustling got louder and closer, a person sprang out of. The woods were big and dark, and Emily's movements were slow and methodical. As she aimed the flashlight at the figure, it flickered, exposing the silhouette of a wolf, its eyes glowing with an strange ferocity, and it remained still while observing them remain behind me. Baxter moved between them and the wolf, his body low-toothed bead, Michael muttered, standing in front of Emily. The wolf, snarling violently, remained motionless and kept staring at it. Emily's thoughts were racing, since this wasn't just a wild animal. There was an unearthly quality about it, and she gripped the compass tightly, sensing its weight as if. She muttered to Michael, "What do we do?" as it was a connection to her father, and Rusty didn't reply. All of his attention was on the wolf, who was now staring at Baxter. The two creatures appeared to be engaged in a stare, a quiet standing off the ground, sparking with tension, and then suddenly the wolf growled softly and stepped forward, and Baxter let out a loud bark. Emily's whole body vibrated with the severity of his warning, causing her to experience a wave of panic, but also an unwavering sense of, have faith in Baxter. He wasn't merely defending her. He was dealing with something much more difficult than any dog could handle. Understand that the wolf hesitated, tilting its head as though deciding what to do next. The world appeared to catch its breath for a brief instant before the wolf abruptly turned and faded into the shadows, leaving only the growls echo behind Baxter, who loosened up a little but kept his. Emily knelt next to him and put her arms around his neck, saying, "Guard down." Her voice was trembling. "You saved us." Even though Michael's face was pale after helping her stand, "We must return." As they turned to depart, Emily looked back at the oak tree that the compass was gripping, but whatever that was, it wasn't over yet. Firmly in her hand, the words of her father replayed in her head, "Believe Baxter, he'll help you when the time comes." And she was fully aware that the moment had returned to the house. Emily sat at the dining table with the compass carefully positioned in front of her, and the air was packed with an unnerving tension. When the sun fell on its weathered metal surface, she could practically picture her father holding it in his last moments. With his head resting on his paws, Baxter rested at her feet, his gaze focused on. Michael paced the compass as though it contained answers that only he could comprehend. Emily was worried that Wolf's room wasn't typical, and his face was lined with. Rusty always thought that something greater was happening here. Emily nodded, her fingers grazing the compass, prevented him from experiencing something that he was unable to explain. Perhaps Baxter was attempting to do the same for me when the room collapsed. Quiet but for the distant ticking of the clock outside, the sound of the wind howling, when the old oak tree's branches outside the window knocked against the glass. Baxter's ears perked up, twitching, and he let. Emily gave Michael a low growl as her heart raced. He sensed something. Michael picked up his coat and flashlight. "If Baxter believes there's a need to check, we should follow him." Baxter led the way as they stepped outside into the chilly dark night. The compass that hung around Emily's neck was intentional and purposeful. It swayed with every step as if it were being. They arrived at the area where the oak tree stood, its twisted branches creating long shadows, drawn to their destiny. The air felt denser here, with shadows in the moonlight, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "What is Michael doing now?" Before Emily could reply, Baxter yelled in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. He started to dig at the tree's base with his strong paws, sending dirt flying. Emily, shocking them both with a sudden start, hurried over to kneel next to him and asked, "Baxter, what are you doing?" Emily reached inside the hole as her voice shook beneath the disturbed soil and something metallic glinted in the moonlight. "I took out a heavy, old, rusted box with dirt all over its surface." Moss opened it with trembling hands and found a small notebook, a photograph, and a pile of worn papers. Emily's breath froze in her throat when she saw the picture of Rusty facing the camera that her father had. Michael knelt next to her and shone the flashlight on the notebook in the oak tree where they were now standing. "What is this?" Emily turned the pages and filled them in with her father's handwriting. The entries were jumbled, but it was evident from his message that he had been terrified of whatever he wrote of odd happenings and a persistent sense. His being observed and Rusty's steadfast will to keep him safe. One entry drew Emily's attention and told her to believe Rusty since he knew the truth. She tightened her hold on the notebook as she read the last few words out loud. "There's something in the woods, something ancient. Rusty has always understood that the phrase is hung, but it's more than simply a wolf. Heavy in the air, Baxter snarled deep and low, his posture tense as the wind rustled the leaves about them. Emily turned to Michael, her face etched with horror. "All these years, he knew," she said. "He was trying to warn me. There was something outside." Michael nodded, his mouth clenched, and now Bayers continued. A distant howl abruptly interrupted Rusty's whereabouts, piercing the dark, sorrowful night. Emily's pulse pounded as the boom reverberated through the forest, and he trembled with anxiety and emitted a. Michael gripped Emily's arm and murmured, "We're not alone." As the wail intensified, Emily's mind raced as she attempted to piece everything together as it became louder, closer, and more people joined her. "It's not just," she claimed that one wolf's voice broke as it struck a pack, and Baxter barked once more. Michael swung the flashlight in a protective stance as shadows started to move at the clearing's edge. At least 3 wolves were visible, their bodies merging together as the glimmer of yellow eyes stared back at them. Emily gripped the compass hard as her father's last words echoed in her head, blending in perfectly with the darkness. Trust Baxter, the lead wolf, advanced with eyes that glowed with unearthly ferocity. Baxter snarled. The tension in the air was high as he moved in front of Emily, his stance steadfast, his teeth bared. Emily could, feeling her heart thumping in her chest. Michael murmured, his voice barely audible. "What should we do?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she knelt next to Baxter and put her hand on his back, showing that we trust him. When the lead wolf growled, it echoed throughout the area, and Baxter responded by barking fiercely. Emily felt a weird energy ripple as the 2 beasts locked eyes, seemingly causing the ground underneath them to tremble. Through the atmosphere, as if the forest itself were alive and observing. And for a brief instant, time appeared to stop. As though in unison, the wolves withdrew into the shadows, their bright eyes fading one by one. With her hand still on Baxter's back, Emily released a trembling breath. "You did it, Michael." Baxter turned to face Emily and spoke in wonder, "Protecting us." When her eyes met hers, she sensed an unbreakable connection that went beyond space and time. Father had been correct. Baxter was aware of the reality and had led her through the peril as the forest collapsed. Emily stood silently again, her compass still firmly grasped in her palm. "This isn't. Whatever my father found is still out," she remarked in a firm voice. Michael put a comforting hand on her shoulder and said, "There, Baxter, and I will find out what it is." They started their journey back to the house with Baxter leading the way, knowing that the answers they were closer than ever before, and that the most important encounter was still to come. The return trip home was, in a tight stillness, Emily's mind was racing with questions about what her father had said. Michael strolled next to her, his flashlight scanning the pitch-black forest as the eerie events of the night reverberated. The unearthed notepad weighed heavily in Baxter's mind as he remained close, his eyes darting toward every shadow. Rusty had defended her father against an ancient force, but now it's Emily's hands, its revelations gnawing at her. Baxter appeared to be carrying out that goal. But why, and what was the real purpose? As they approached the property's boundary, the familiar sight of the house reminded them of the danger that pervaded these woods. Came into view, but rather than feeling relieved, Emily felt cold. Michael stopped suddenly, as the door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Did you leave the door open?" Emily shook her head. "No, I locked it before we went." Baxter growled softly, his fur standing on end as he. Michael moved in front of them, gripped the flashlight tightly, and signaled to Emily to wait. He muttered, but Emily firmly shook her head, saying, "No, we do this together." Slowly made their way back to the house, which was dark inside. The air felt thick as they entered, save for the dim glimmer of the kitchen light flowing down the hallway. Stifling, like the house itself was holding its breath, Michael remained close. Emily nodded and gripped the notebook tightly as he whispered something that was hardly audible. Smelling the air, Baxter moved slowly and deliberately, growing once more. As they moved into the living room, Emily's tight physique caused the compass around her neck to start swaying strangely, as if Emily whispered what was happening, pulled by an unseen power. Michael, who was shaking, brought up the spotlight, exposing the living room in a state of chaos. The furniture was flipped over, and the broken pieces of the family picture frames were all over the floor, and the compass dangled in the middle of the room. While tugging at the leash as though attempting to escape, Baxter gave a piercing growl while keeping his eyes focused on a corner of Emily's breath caught as the air became cooler in the chamber where the shadows appeared to shift strangely. A harsh, guttural growl suddenly reverberated around the room, apparent in the faint light. Michael held up the torch, not from Baxter, but from the shadows themselves. Suddenly, a huge, ghostly wolf appeared as the beam fell upon a pair of luminous eyes. Transparent and glimmering with a spooky light, its presence was both majestic and menacing, and its eyes were fixed on. Michael automatically took a step back when he saw Emily's hands, shuddered as she gripped the journal more tightly. I believe this is what my father was warning about the snarling, spectral wolf. Its shape trembling as it approached Baxter, who positioned himself between Emily and. Despite their disparate sizes, the beast resisted Baxter's growls. Unwavering, Emily's words, "Trust him," replayed in her head as she gazed at Baxter, giving her a boost of courage. Kneeling next to her faithful friend, she put a hand on his back and whispered, "We're in this together." The compass grew. Emily went for it and unhooked it as it felt hotter against her chest and had an almost magnetic pull. It from her neck and then soared into the air, twisting furiously before aiming straight toward the beast, a phantom wolf, howled so loudly that the energy in the room seemed to quake. Emily opened the journal as the walls began to vibrate more intensely, as though the house itself were responding to the altercation. Her father had said something about the compass being more than a keepsake, and she was anxiously turning over the pages. The purpose of the key was to seal the force that had been endangering their family for generations. "Michael," she said. Michael turned to her, his face pallid, and yelled, "I think I know what to do." Despite her dread, Emily's voice was steady as she responded, "Do you need me to get the compass into the light?" The ghostly wolf came forward, its fangs snapping, but Baxter pushed it away, jumped into its direction, and intercepted it, colliding with it as a flare of light burst forth. Baxter yelled from the collision, but his resolve remained unshakable. The compass followed Emily as she sprinted toward the kitchen, where the light was strongest, getting brighter with each step. To buy her more time to go to the kitchen, Michael snatched up a fallen chair and swung it at the ghostly wolf. Emily held the "Come on," she said, the compass's glow lighting up the room. The ghostly wolf turned its eyes on her, shuddering. "Let's put an end to this." It charged, flaming with fury, but as it approached the kitchen's threshold, the creature howled in pain as the compass released a dazzling light, and its shape vanished into smoke vapors inside the house. Became silent as an overwhelming sensation of serenity replaced the oppressive weight in the air. Emily crouched next to Baxter as he hobbled toward her, his tail wagging feebly. She was crying as she gave him a firm hug. "You succeeded, Baxter. Michael joined them and saved us." His hand on Emily's shoulder was amazing. Emily nodded, her heart still pounding, "But I've never seen anything like it." Together, they stood in the silence, and I believe we finally allayed my father's worries and whatever they were. Even though the threat had passed, Emily's compass was suddenly chilly in her hand. Emily was prepared to face whatever lay ahead since she understood that this was only the start of a greater mystery. Came next. The house was silent. The shadows were no longer moving maliciously, but they were still covered within. Baxter nestled up against Emily as she sat on the kitchen floor in an uncomfortable stillness. The once threatening compass rested in her palm, its brilliance dimming to a slight warmth, breathing steadily but heavily. Michael crouched next to her, looking around the room for any remaining threats. "Do you think it's truly gone?" inquired in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper, and Emily nodded slowly. "I believe." Even if there was a hint of doubt in her voice, "I believe the compass did its job, but it's not merely." Regarding the wolf, there's more to this than my father ever completely described. Baxter shifted, releasing a. Emily stared down at him as he licked her hand. Her heart swelled with appreciation and grief at his unflinching. She could see the toll it had taken on his elderly body. His muscles were shaking, his fur was matted, but courage had rescued them. Emily stroked his head and muttered, "I don't know," with tiredness. "You were so brave." Michael looked toward the living room, where the scars from the phantom meeting were still visible, and wondered what he would do without you. He stated that it is obvious that we should clean this up, but first I believe we need to determine. What all of this indicates is that compass is more than just a memento. Emily nodded as she ran her fingertips over the elaborate engravings on the compass, which belonged to my dad, as he always said. I always assumed it was just a sentimental artifact that had been passed down through the family, but now I see it's. Michael crossed his arms and leaned against the counter, something much larger. "Do you believe your father anticipated this occur, which is why he penned those notes?" Emily scowled as she looked over her father's notebook again. The pages containing accounts of bizarre encounters were filled with careful handwriting. She paused on one page where he had written, "The compass contains the warnings and mysterious allusions to its power." Emily muttered, her brow furrowing, "The secret to safeguarding the bond." He frequently discussed his relationship with Rusty, his former dog, saying that it was unshakable and transcended what? Michael bent his head in a way that most people might understand, suggesting that this link is related to the. Emily, using compass, glanced at Baxter, who was now resting his head on her lap. "I believe there's more to Baxter than that. In addition to being a devoted dog, he also acts as a guardian, just like Rusty did for my dad." Michael squatted next to her, part of the bond, this force that prevents whatever it was from taking hold. His expression is serious, so Baxter isn't merely defending you out of love for you. He's. Emily's chest constricted at the idea of shielding something larger. But what will happen when he's unable to? As he grew older, Michael put a comforting hand on her shoulder and said, "Tonight, you took so much out of me." Emily nodded, "But you're not alone in this. You've got your father's notes to help you work it out." With the burden of responsibility bearing down on her, she turned to the notebook's final page and discovered a passage. "When the moment comes, believe the compass and the bond it is written in bold characters will lead you to the truth before she can further consider its significance." Baxter abruptly raised his head. His eyes were fixed on the doorway leading to Emily and Michael's garden as his ears pricked up and he softly barked. Looked at each other, and they immediately followed his example by going outside into the refreshing night air. Baxter hobbled forward to greet them, the sky now clear and full of stars. Emily's heart pounded as he guided them toward the wood's edge, nose to the ground, uncertain of what they may. When he stopped next to an elderly man, she gently followed him and asked, "Fine, what is it, boy?" "Twisted tree whose roots grip the earth like claws," Baxter sniffed the tree's base, then poured water on the ground. Emily huddled next to him, raking leaves off the ground. Mud. Her fingers struck a little, corroded metal box, and Michael bent down to assist her in prying it up, and they discovered a piece of parchment folded in an old. The image displayed her father as a young man, standing with Rusty by his side with pride. The parchment was written in faded letters, but one line made it obvious that the bond must go on. "The compass will select the next victim when the protector becomes weak." Emily's breath caught as she read the words What does it mean then? Michael gazed at her with a mixture of wonder and worry. "Believe it indicates that Bear isn't the last. This link transcends a particular canine or individual and is a." Emily's eyes filled with legacy tears as she turned to face Baxter, who smiled back at her with unflinching confidence. "So this isn't." Michael nodded, "And you're now a part of it. In the end, it's just another chapter." Emily experienced a peculiar feeling of peace as they carried the box back to the house, exactly like your dad did. With Baxter at her side and the compass pointing her in the right direction, she knew she was safe even though the mystery was far from resolved. As Emily sat in her chair, the first rays of morning peeked through the curtains, giving her the fortitude to face whatever lay ahead. His breathing was calm and slow, and he was lying at her feet in an armchair with the compass in her hands. Reminder of his unwavering devotion, the home was quiet, and the air is now lighter as. Michael poured her a cup of tea and put it on her, even though the secrets it had maintained were finally starting to fade. "It's been a long night," he remarked quietly as he sat across from her at the table next to her. "But you succeeded, Emily. You found the truth." She nodded while running her fingertips over the compass's weathered edges. not all of. I know now that this is just the beginning, she said, but my dad left. This is why he wanted me to comprehend the connection and continue it. Her eyes shifted to Baxter, whose tale provided. A slight wag at the sound of her voice, tears filled her eyes. He has been my steadfast defender for years. Partner. And I can now see how much more he is. He's a part of something greater than myself, Michael. Leaning forward and speaking softly. He's not only keeping you safe, Emily. He's also guiding you and will show you the way when the time comes. Emily nodded and wiped a tear from her face before reaching for and turning through her father's notebook. You'll know what to do. The last lines leapt out at her once again as she turned the pages one last time. Take a deep breath and close the notebook, trusting the relationship to guide you. She firmly stated, I'll put it aside and trust it for Baxter, for my dad, and for whatever happens next. Emily felt at peace as the sun rose higher, filling the room with its warm brightness. Had not realized for years that the difficulties were far from ended, but she knew she wasn't alone in them. So she knelt down. With her hands caressing Baxter's fur, she muttered, Thank you. Baxter's voice was full of emotion for everything, and his eyes softly whined. Emily glanced up at Michael and met her with a level of understanding that words could not express. Fresh resolve, we'll work this out together, Michael grinned. Unshakable faith in her. I'm sure we will. As the day progressed, Emily started arranging the artifacts she had found and planning while going over her father's papers. She felt prepared to move forward despite the uncertainty of the road ahead. If you were moved by this tale, please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Amazing connection between people and animals, or share your thoughts on the mysteries Emily revealed. Remember to subscribe to our channel and like the video for more touching and motivational tales. The notification bell to ensure you don't miss any updates. We appreciate your participation in this trip and hope to see you soon. Our next video, which will feature other tales of bravery, devotion, and the enduring relationship between people and animals.